Hi, welcome to this topic in Soccer 1010, which is on youth. And as usual, I'm going to break up this lecture into 4 smaller recordings, looking at youth studies, youth cultures, youth transitions, and then going to conclude with looking at the idea of youth and young people's lives through some of the concepts we've looked at throughout the whole course. Okay, so let's start off with part 1, youth studies. So to begin with, I think it might be a good idea to actually watch an example of some of the things I'm going to critique here. If you click on that YouTube link, you'll see an example of what I think is quite useful sociological critique done by a comedy show, The Chaser. It's a little bit old now. I think this is about 10 years old. But they kind of use almost moral panic techniques to do an analysis of the moral panics about young people in the media. So I think the first thing you should do is stop now, click on that, have a look at that. It begins at 19 minutes and 56 seconds into the longer video, and then come back and watch the rest of the lecture. So, as you'll see in that piece, what they critique here is the way that young people are used as kind of fodder for moral panics and sensationalism in the news, and particularly in current affairs shows. What's interesting about this is that young people have here to play this kind of folk devil role in society, for millennia. The quote here is actually from Socrates, 1,000 years ago or whatever. The children now love luxury. They've had bad manners. They have contempt for authority. They show disrespect to their elders. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up dainties at the table, cross their legs and are torrents over their teachers. So Socrates was going on about how bad young people were back in the day, and move here to the 80s, you have this American literary critic saying all these kind of things that how bad young people are at that time. In this case, it's about pop culture and about listening to pop culture as this kind of what he calls prepackaged masturbational fantasy. I won't read that whole quote. I'll leave that up to you to look at there. But we can see this is happening constantly throughout history and throughout different societies as well and cultures. So youth in general occupy a kind of unique place in the popular imagination. It seems to be that as people get older, they forget what it's like to be a young person. They inevitably seem to start looking at young people through the lens that they're the problem, that all the things wrong in the world are kind of, attached to their practices and it's there to blame. There's constant moral panics about young people, and there's certainly very little chance for young people to represent themselves in the various powerful institutions that we've been looking at throughout the course. Most politicians are over 40, all these kind of media workers might work their way up, but tend not to get into influential positions until about the same time. So young people are kind of denigrated in all these ways, but they're also kind of idealized in ways as well. They're certainly their images are kind of young, edgy, sexy, cool kind of images are used for marketing purposes all the time, and certainly central to the way popular consumer culture functions. And they're also used this kind of figurative kind of stand-in for the future. If young people are okay, the future's okay. So what I'm talking about here is youth as a kind of broad concept. And the way that kind of youth studies considers these things is youth itself is a concept to think about a particular period or a particular way of thinking about young people generally. And young people are the actual young people themselves. So just kind of keep that in mind when I use those different terms. And you can see this happen all the time through pop culture. I often hear, older people today, there's no such thing as political music anymore. And that's just generally more an expression as older people kind of lose touch with what's going on in the world rather than, any lack of artistic or resistive engagement that happens in pop culture. And the silly meme there's a good example of that because, back in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of kind of, not necessarily all that meaningful stuff going on in pop music and rock music as well. So, in terms of youth studies, one way of thinking about this is kind of rehashed all the time is Bourdieu talks about how youth is just a word. And what he means here is that the notion of youth is used in such an overgeneralized, stereotypical, often sensationalist way that it kind of loses any meaning, because there's as much, difference between, whatever the age category we're calling youth. There's as much differences as commonalities between them. So what's interesting about this is the division between young and old imposes kind of power limits and produces this kind of notions of generational difference that we looked at in the week on social change and changing the world. So new generations come along, they have new kind of ways of thinking, new kind of social, cultural, economic conditions are around as well. So, young people are often born into a world that's quite different than their parents were born into. They face, different circumstances. Therefore, they have different ways of being, different norms, and different lifestyles. Older people then to kind of disconnect from this and kind of sets up these kind of generational struggles. What's interesting about this is the different ways that youth is kind of invoked in these popular political, media and pop culture kind of usages. And I've written a paper about that called Figures of Youth, that if you're interested in looking at the different ways that young people are figured in the media and in politics and in broader discourses, you can check that out. So, the key thing that we looked at earlier in the course in the week on culture and media was this idea of moral panics, and young people are constant objects of moral panic. They're kind of a folk devil in that kind of theoretical sense. This seems to have been happening, while ever there's been media. Particularly, this is often around the case of youth cultures and particularly subcultures. Molds and rockers, bodgies and widgies in Australia in the 50s and later, punks, goths, emos, 80s, westies, all these kind of different things. If you want an example of a kind of classic moral panic story, there's a link there to have a look at. Now, please take notice of that content warning. And what that is a kind of old Today Tonight story about emos and, the connection of this subculture to kind of violence and suicide. Again, they kind of reverse the polarity of what subcultures are for. Most people enter these kind of alternate subcultures as a way of identifying with others that are like them. They're particularly attractive to people that are pushed out of, mainstream society, not necessarily popular, and they find other people like them to kind of live with and, be creative with, or even just talk to. What that story does is kind of then really does the opposite. It blames the subculture for this kind of bad behaviour and tragic behaviour of two particular teenagers. And this is a very normal kind of framing of youth culture and the individualisation of these things. There's lots of different kind of ways that the moral panic things happen. They're often over forms of deviance and lifestyle choice. There's moral panics over the threats and risks to young people, and particularly around adult predatory behaviour, and certainly the rise of digital cultures and social media have seen new facets of that as well. So this is not to say there isn't, young people doing the wrong thing, or there are not threats to young people. It's more the sensationalised nature of these things and how they distort the reality of the situation. The way moral panics mostly work is they kind of scapegoat individuals or blame, young people for issues and problems in society that are really much more structural, that they have very little control over. Also, many of the things around deviance and lifestyle choice seem to relate to kind of the normal rites of passage thing that kind of happens in that liminal period from being a child to an adult, as you learn all the things to kind of, be an adult in a particular society. And this means exposure to things like, sex, drugs, rock and roll, all that kind of stuff that's then linked to the moral panics and deviance and these kind of things. So there's a kind of weird juxtaposition here between actual normal everyday socialization and growing up, which includes these kind of things, and then the sensationalizing nature of the way that they're represented in the media. So what does this all mean in terms of the idea of youth studies? Youth studies is a kind of relatively recent kind of sub-discipline of sociology. It's a little bit interdisciplinary as well. But importantly, when I use the term youth studies, it's not just every bit of research about young people that includes young people, or is it about them? Youth studies the research is done more of a kind of perspective that's done with young people. Research done from their point of view rather than research done on them or about them. And it's a really critical distinction because as we've been looking at throughout the course, much critical sociology argues that many of the institutions and interventions into people's lives, people in general, but we're talking about young people here, don't necessarily have the kind of positive effects that they're imagined for, even if those intentions are good. They have these kind of more governmentalized forms of understanding that create different kinds of discipline, different way of disciplining individuals to be good workers, good citizens, and that kind of thing, that may not necessarily be in their own interests. Youth studies has a kind of similar orientation in some ways to many of the interventions into young people's lives, whether social work or youth work or education systems or the criminal justice system and all these things really, have positive effects on young people's lives. This is because young people tend to be in this kind of institutionalized mistrust position and are artifacts of expertise, which is from Peter Kelly's really influential work from the late 90s and early 2000s in youth studies. Youth almost solely exists as a kind of category invented by experts to kind of do certain things with their expertise on them. So this is an important way of thinking about the power structures of young people's lives, the way they engage with institutions, particularly if they're disadvantaged, particularly if they've transgressed in various ways, and then all of a sudden have these institutions making interventions into their lives. So youth studies, very important takeout here is that not just young people in research. There'll be lots of research papers out there that are about young people. Youth studies ones are more kind of with young people, and it's important kind of distinction to make. So traditionally there's been two areas of youth studies, youth cultures and youth transitions, and more recently these things are being brought together, and the distinction between those two things is increasingly meaningless. But in the next part of the lecture, I'll go on to talk about youth culture.